Okay, so this review will be pretty short because I'll just give you the overview. I'll do all the studying for you in some ways. You've still got to do the real work, but I'll give you all the topics that are on the exam and give you a quick overview of what they are. You should call me. Some of you need to call me. This is my home phone number because you need work on your translations. Some of you need to call me just for this exam. It doesn't matter. We can get most of the business done in a pretty short amount of time. You don't have to call me for an hour. Or Skype me. Skype me is much better. We don't need to turn on the cameras. I obviously won't turn on the camera. We don't need to look at each other. We need to be able to type and talk at the same time. Talking on the phone's okay. Email's okay. Skype is the best because we can type and talk at the same time. Chapter 20 covers the indicative future active. For the first and second conjugation verbs, you end them with bo, bis, bit, bimis, bitis, bunt. B-U-N-T, not B-I-N-T. And you use the second principal part. You have to know which principal part you use. For the future, it's the second principal part. For the third I, and fourth principal parts, you use s, es, et, emis, etis, ent. That's how you conjugate it. I, you, he, she, it, we, you, all, they. Both of them use the second principal part, but the two conjugations are conjugated slightly differently. In this chapter, also, you learn the superlative in ER. You add rimus, rima, rimum. Sorry, that's a typo. Rimum, R-I-M-U-M, not S. That's how you do the superlative. It is declined just like any other 2-1-2 adjective, like bonus, bona, bonum. Rimus, rima, rimum. You add that to the adjectival root, which is found from the second thing in the dictionary. There's the masculine adjective, like bonus, then there's bona, then there's bonum, masculine, feminine, neuter. The second thing in the dictionary, you drop the ending, which is an A, and then you add rimus, rima, rimum. This chapter also teaches you domus, domus. Okay, that's an irregular noun that has two forms for the genitive. Your lexical entry for a noun always has a nominative singular and a genitive singular. The gender varies, masculine, feminine, or neuter. But the genitive singular for domus, the Romans couldn't ever decide whether they wanted domus or domi. You can't tell, you can't predict it, you have to memorize both. It's a minor point, but it's an easy one for me to test you on for the exam, because it's the little things like that that make you really good at the language. Chapter 21 teaches you hic, hike, hoc. That's for the thing that's closer to you, this. Chapter 22 teaches you illa, illa, illud. That's the thing that's further away from you. That. You have to memorize hic, hike, hoc, and you have to memorize illa, illa, illud. I can't do that for you. That's something you have to sit down and do. They're very irregular. Chapter 21 also teaches you the imperative present active. It's always mood, tense, and voice. That's such an easy conjugation that I can teach it to you again in this short little review. Take the second principal part, the second thing in the dictionary. As usual, you drop the re, era, re. Anytime you deal with the second principal part, you drop the re, era, re. Re is for the first conjugation, re is for the second conjugation, era is for the third conjugation, era is for the third conjugation, and re is again for the fourth conjugation. And then you add nothing if it's the first conjugation. You add nothing after you drop the re for the second conjugation. You add e after you drop the ere for the third conjugation. You add e after you drop the ere for the third I conjugation. And then you add nothing when you drop the re to the fourth conjugation. That's a second person singular you. Like, hey you, shut up. The imperative is used for a command. Usually followed by an exclamation point to make it emphasized. For the plural, you add te. For the plural, you add te. For the plural of this one, you add ite. Plural of this one, same story, ite. And for the plural of this one, you just add te. Hey, you all, shut up. That's the imperative present active, second person singular, second person plural. Passive voice, nobody really learns grammar in school. Even if you do learn a foreign language, you don't really go over things like voice. So it's difficult to teach from scratch, and a lot of people have difficulty with it, but the subject receives the action rather than the subject doing the action. The ball is the subject in this sentence, and it is thrown. It receives the throwing. Now, the part in brackets, I can add that detail, but it's not necessary for the sentence. I can just say a sentence, the ball is thrown, period. I can indicate the agent or the doer, but the subject in this case receives the action. In this other sentence, the boy throws the ball, boy is the subject, and boy does the action. I could say the boy is thrown, but then the boy is receiving the action. That's the difference. The ball, I can add any kind of object. That the boy throws the pen, the boy throws the eraser, the boy throws the computer. But the point is the boy is the subject and he does the action in the second of the two examples. In the first example, the ball is thrown. Or again, the boy is thrown. The subject gets action done to it. You can use the ablative case ending for that part in the brackets, by the boy. In Latin, that would be a, by, puero. A or ab, puero. It would be ab if it were followed by a vowel. And you can have any mood in this passive voice, including the infinitive, which is a particular lesson taught in this chapter. You can have an indicative passive, you can have a subjunctive passive, an infinitive passive, a participle passive, and imperative passive. You can even have all those tenses in the passive. But this chapter in particular teaches you the infinitive passive, so look that up if you don't understand what that means or if you haven't practiced conjugating it. The chapter also teaches you qui, quae, quod. That's the relative pronoun. The relative pronoun refers back to something in the sentence. For example, you'd have a relative pronoun, that is the girl whom I love. Whom is the relative pronoun. That's the relative pronoun, and you have to memorize it. It's too irregular to not memorize. This chapter also teaches you the fourth declension. Fourth declension has to be memorized. It's not the most common declension, but it appears in Latin, so you can't get by without knowing it. There are some feminine words, but they're mostly masculine. There are some neuters. There are very few feminine. And that's not really an important point. The important point is that you memorize how to decline the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and vocative in the fourth declension. And I do not emphasize the vocative in this course. It is rare in real Latin, and so I don't teach it too much. Chapter 18 teaches you the participle perfect passive. Again, it's mood, tense, and voice. Participle perfect is identical with the fourth principal part for every verb that you learn. If you learn every fourth principal part, you'll be really good in this class. If you can at least look up every fourth principal part, you'll be competent in the class. It's much better to memorize every first, second, third, and fourth principal part. It makes the class easy. It makes all of the concepts much easier. If you can't do all that, at least know how to look up the fourth principal part in the dictionary. An important point is that the participle is an adjective. The participle is an adjective that is formed out of a verb. So you take a verb like running, and you can say, that's the running girl. The participle perfect passive, that's how I'm abbreviating it, is translated as having been loved or just loved. Like that is the beloved or the loved girl. Or having been called or called. That's the man that I called. Or the having been prepared. Or just prepared. That's the meal that was prepared. It's an adjective, prepared. That's the meal that was big. That's the meal that was hot. That's the meal that was yellow. All of those are adjectives, including prepared. That's the participle perfect passive. Passive voice, just like we were discussing earlier, except in this case, you take a verb and turn it into an adjective. Quis quid is presented in this chapter. That's the interrogative pronoun. It's different from the relative pronoun, obviously, in its spelling. Interrogative means it asks a question. For example, who is that girl? Who is at the door? Qui quod quod is the interrogative adjective. Interrogative adjective is different from interrogative pronoun because an interrogative adjective needs a noun to modify. For example, instead of saying in the interrogative pronoun, who is at the door, you would say with an interrogative adjective, which girl is at the door? You see, the interrogative adjective needs to modify a girl, which man, which dog. That's the interrogative adjective. Interrogative pronoun is who is barking, who is at the door, who was that. Interrogative pronoun does not require an adjective to modify. The confusing thing, arguably, is that qui quod quod is spelled and pronounced exactly the same as qui quod quod, the relative pronoun. The relative pronoun and the interrogative adjective are pronounced and spelled exactly the same. They're two different words, but in Latin, they're pronounced and spelled exactly the same. You have that in English. You have two and two and two. There are three different words that you use differently. The last point is that you have the irregular verb io, ira, iwi. Note that its third principal part has two options. And then the fourth principal part is itas, ita, and itam. Third principal part can be ee for I have gone or I went. I have gone or I went, either one's acceptable. Or it can also be ev or iwi for I have gone or I went. The rest of the declension, conjugation, doesn't have two options, but the first person singular, I, does. Again, just like domus, the Romans couldn't make up their mind, so they have two forms, and you have to memorize them and deal with that. Chapter 19 teaches you the fifth declension. You've got to memorize it. It's mostly feminine, but there is one masculine word. There's no neuter whatsoever. Gender is not really usually an issue. It's just a minor point. Which is very, very important. One of the most important things in this class is third declension adjectives are introduced in Chapter 19, and they're all over Latin. They're very common. That should be taught in one of the first lessons. It's not, because they are complicated. You need to memorize it. You need to work on it. If you can't read and identify the case, number, and gender of every third declension adjective, this class is so hard for you. This class is as difficult as it can get because third declension adjectives are everywhere. Memorize those. Make that your priority. If you only do one thing, memorize third declension adjectives. Note that there's only two little things really taught in Chapter 19 because third declension adjectives are that important. Chapter 20 teaches you the indicative perfect passive voice. We just talked about the passive voice. That's when the subject receives the action. The declensions for this are very predictable. For the indicative perfect passive, you take the fourth principal part, masculine, feminine, or neuter, depending on what the subject is. So if the subject is masculine, take the masculine form. If the subject is feminine, take the feminine form. If the subject is neuter, take the third neuter form. The third form is neuter. And then you add sum if it's I, or s if it's you, or est if it's he, she, it, or sumus, or estis, or sunt. The indicative pluperfect passive is the fourth principal part plus eram, eras, or erat, eramus, eratus, or errant. If you don't understand what I'm saying now in this little review, eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, errant, you need to go back and look at the indicative pluperfect passive. The indicative future perfect passive. Take the fourth principal part. Choose the masculine form, or choose the feminine form, or choose the neuter form. Every time you have the fourth principal part, that's an adjective, so you have to choose the gender. If the subject is masculine, choose the masculine form every single time. And then you add ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erunt. And again, you might expect errant with an I, but it's errunt with a U. If that doesn't ring a bell, you got to go back and master that. Future perfect is a low priority because it doesn't happen that much in Latin. But it's represented fairly commonly on this exam. The chapter also introduces idem, iadem, idem. That's another irregular form that you have to memorize. I can't give you a system to memorize that easier. I can't do that for you. It's a little bit difficult, but it's not impossible, because even the irregularities in Latin are somewhat predictable. You just got to practice them. And if you know qui, qui, quod, and if you know illa, illa, illud, and hic, hic, hoc, then idem, iadem, idem becomes easier. If you've blown off the work, if you don't memorize hic, hic, hoc, well then of course idem, iadem, idem is just going to be another impossible task for you in this class. Start from the beginning. If you're falling behind during this midterm exam, call me, Skype me, or study really hard for this exam, because it's not too late. This class does get pretty hard though by the midterm exam and after that as far as the translations go. This chapter also introduces deponent verbs. If you don't understand what a deponent verb is, the summary is that they look like they're passive. They're spelled like they're passive. For example, the verb conar looks like a passive ending. That means I attempt or I try. However, even though it has a passive ending, it's translated as if it's an active verb, I try. That's the weird thing about deponent verbs. They look like they're passive, they're spelled like they're passive, they're pronounced like they're passive, but when you translate them as if they're active. This slide has a few redundancies, starting right here down on F. Everything else I've already covered. The reflexive pronoun has no nominative. The genitive is sui, the dative is sibi, the accusative is say or say. The Romans couldn't make up their mind. The ablative is say or say, and the plural is exactly the same. No nominative, the genitive is sui, the dative plural is sibi, the accusative is say, or sometimes it could be say, and the ablative is say, and sometimes it can be say. That's complicated. It's redundant. It's a little less for you to memorize, but the concept is harder. At any rate, the reflexive pronoun refers back to the subject of the sentence. For example, I love her is not reflexive because her does not refer back to I. I love myself is a reflexive pronoun. That refers back to I. I've gone through these concepts incredibly quickly. I can't reteach them to you at this point, but I can at least remind you of exactly what's on the exam and what you should be working on. As you go through this exam or this review in 15 or 20 minutes, however long this screencast is, and it's too fast for you, and you have no idea what I'm talking about on half the stuff or all the stuff, that means you need to call me. That's it. It'll take 15, 20 minutes, maybe it'll take an hour. I'll spend whatever time it takes, but the class is going to get hard if you don't know the material on the midterm. Good luck on your exam. I hope to hear from many of you. This is me saying bye.